Hi, I'm Richard Murphy, and this is the seventh in the video series on the importance of tax transparency. In videos 5 and 6 of this series, we discussed who the interested parties of a tax system might be, and then discussed what information some of those interested parties might need and how that might be communicated to them. In this video, we want to expand upon the issue of communicating with taxpayers, which is a subject that has been close to my heart throughout more than 40 years of working in tax. There are a wide range of decisions that must be made when deciding upon how to communicate with taxpayers. For example, it's important to decide upon what languages should be used when communicating with taxpayers. Even if there is only one official language, if others are used, then how many does information need to be provided? And how? What's the role of non-written communication, especially if literacy rates are low? How a tax authority can be made visible in the community, for example, through the presence of local tax officers at which training events, help sessions, and more might be provided. How hard to reach communities are to be addressed, especially if they are engaged in informal economic activities. Or are they to be ignored? But at what cost? What use is to be made of radio, television, and other media, including YouTube videos, and what use can be made of mobile phone platforms? There are also important things that people need to know as taxpayers. These include, what is the tax law and where can it be found? Where can online advice be obtained? What legal interpretations of the law have been decided upon? And where, perhaps most importantly, can personal help and support be obtained? In addition, in the midst of all this focus on communication, it is vital to remember that the tax authority must guarantee taxpayer privacy and provide an affordable right of appeal to people who don't agree with what the tax authority is doing. Transparency is essential, but not when it comes to putting individual taxpayers' data into the public domain. People who pay tax, as well as others in their community, also need to know the following if they're to have the necessary confidence in the tax system, so that they might be encouraged to pay the taxes that they owe. Enough information to enable them to reach judgments on the performance of the tax system. In other words, is it properly enforced? And are most people paying what is expected of them? What are the government's goals with regard to the tax system, including why have they chosen to tax in the way that they do? How has this changed over time? And how is it expected to change? What are the specific objectives that they want to achieve? And what are the detailed projections of future tax revenues for each annual budgeting and reporting period, along with the sources of information and assumptions underlying all estimates and projections? Now, I admit that not everyone might need that last data, but if some do, it should be made available. Those people who want this data will be opinion formers, and they matter. In addition, it's important that all taxes and their administrative frameworks are codified in law, with changes in policy and substantive administration being made through a legislative process involving consultation with stakeholders and civil society, details of which should be made available to anyone who is interested.
Hello, I'm Raquel Ferreira, and this is the second part of our seventh in the video series on the importance of tax transparency. The public should not only receive relevant information about the tax system, but should also have the opportunity to use this information to participate in the development and implementation of fiscal policies, including revenue and tax policies. This highlights the importance of public participation in the tax system. Public participation in this context refers to the variety of ways in which non-state actors can interact directly in public discussion and deliberation with state entities. Public participation may take many different forms. It may be through face-to-face communication, deliberation or input to decision-making, written forms of communication, including via the internet, or a combination of different mechanisms. It is essentially a means to ensure that all those with a stake in, or who are affected by, or who are intended to benefit from fiscal policies have a voice in decisions that affect their lives. Transparency and public participation are mutually reinforcing. Access to adequate, timely, and useful information is essential for informed, effective public participation. Simultaneously, opportunities for participation create an incentive for the public to request and utilize available information. Together, they can strengthen policy choices, increase public support for public policy or budget decisions, and strengthen oversight, all of which can ultimately improve development outcomes. There are multiple public participation tools and channels. However, randomly choosing a tool and undertaking public participation just for the sake of doing it is likely to be ineffective and undermine trust. It is, as a result, important that when embarking on a public participation journey, desired engagement results are determined and matched with appropriate tools so that meaningful public participation can take place. Designing appropriate public participation mechanisms requires that decisions are taken on the objectives, target audience, timing, scope, and formats of participation. At the outset, public participation mechanisms should have a clear purpose and objectives. To have impact, objectives should align with, reinforce, and complement fiscal policy goals. Answering the following questions can assist in this identification. How will participation help to achieve revenue policy goals? Who is the target audience? And what is the degree of involvement necessary to achieve the policy objectives? When thinking about the objective of public participation, answering the following questions is key. Are there problems that can be solved or mitigated through public participation? Is there room for public influence over the decision? How will public inputs be used? Are there constraints around the decision that limit the scope to engage the public? What characteristics will successful decisions or processes have regarding participation? This approach allows efforts to be directed towards participation for results. Secondly, the target audience should be determined based on the policy issue to be addressed, the purpose sought, and the context. Answering the following questions helps to identify the participating audience. Who will be affected by the policy decisions? How can traditionally excluded groups be included? Are there interest groups or organized groups that could capture or undermine the decision process? Who wants to and who can effectively participate? There are two main approaches: engaging with the general public to receive broad feedback and engaging with small, select, and specialized groups, such as civil society organizations, academia, think tanks, and multi-stakeholder committees to receive in-depth feedback on particular aspects of the revenue policy. Lastly, it is important to determine when and how the public participation should take place. Timing is important to achieve maximum results. It should be determined at what stage in the revenue policy process is participation feasible and desirable, as well as what are the entry points in the revenue policy cycle calendar. Turning to the how, the scope, format, and degree of participation, the target audience's involvement needs to be decided to determine the appropriate mechanism. The International Association for Public Participation has developed a spectrum to help define the public's role in and manage expectations of public participation processes. It covers different objectives for governments to consider when consulting citizens, ranging from informing to consulting, involving, collaborating, and finally empowering the public. The spectrum is based on the idea that the level of public participation is linked to the potential level of public influence on the action or decision being considered. At the beginning of the spectrum, to inform, there are no expectations of receiving feedback and no specific public impact expected, compared to the other end of the spectrum, to empower, where there is an expectation that citizens will make decisions and therefore have an increased level of public impact. Applicable participation tools vary accordingly. For example, if the objective is to keep the public informed, listen to and acknowledge their concerns, and then provide feedback on how public input can influence the government's decision, appropriate tools could include social media discussions, surveys, interviews, and blogs. This will likely involve consultations with communities. If the objective is, instead, empowerment, then tools include decision-making through online voting, participatory budgeting, and direct community actions. Advisory councils with delegated capacities in specific sectors may also need to be established in this case. In summary, matching the tools and participation policies to the objectives of participation is crucial. The risks of not clarifying the public's role are large. For example, if members of the public are led to believe that their feedback will be incorporated or responded to, and it is not, they may become dissatisfied with the outcome and lose trust in the process. This spectrum thus assists governments to shape the design of any public participation mechanism and to manage the risks of public expectations.
In summary, it's all too easy to think that communication about tax simply refers to the details of the way in which the tax system actually functions. That, however, is not true within a transparent tax system. Transparent tax systems have to explain not just the detail of their operation, but also why they exist, what purpose they fulfill, how taxpayers can be sure that the tax system operates within the rule of law, and what is expected of them as taxpayers. In the next video, we look at practical issues surrounding all these matters.